All right, so we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Abby Currier, and I'm the Community Engagement and Events Coordinator here at the History Center of Olmsted County. I'm so excited to see everyone on here tonight, and I look forward to learning more this evening about cover crops. Here at the History Center of Olmsted County, we invite people to gather and explore and examine our past as we educate ourselves about the stories of Olmsted County and southeastern Minnesota. We are so excited that you have decided to join us tonight as we take a look at one of these stories. Tonight, we're going to have a presentation from Ethan Swanson on the gardening for the future, the importance of cover crops. After his presentation, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. During the presentation, feel free to drop any questions that you may have in the chat, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can. You can access the chat at the bottom of your screen. It looks like a little message icon. But before we can get started, I did want to go over a couple of logistical things. For tonight, we are going to keep all of you muted so that we can listen to our speaker. Like I said, if you have any questions, put them into the chat and we will do our best to answer them later, or you can unmute yourself at the very end when we ask for questions. We may also put some links in the chat throughout the night, so make sure you keep an eye on it. Anything that we put in there, we will be sure to send to you tomorrow, along with a short survey about tonight's program. It will take less than 2 minutes to fill out, and we really appreciate your feedback. We also recommend watching this in presenter view, but if you want to see everyone participating, you can do that by clicking on presentation view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you are joining us from an iPad, you may have to swipe a couple of times to change the view. We are recording tonight's program, so please keep that in mind. We're so excited about tonight's talk, and we hope that you'll continue to join us for some of our future events, where we will talk about everything from federal medical centers to Civil War battlefields photography and everything in between. These talks are one of the many great benefits to having a membership to the History Center of Olmsted County. We certainly hope that you will continue to join us for these talks, and we also hope that you will consider getting a membership to experience even more benefits. Tonight, we are joined by Ethan Swanson, who grew up gardening on the impossibly good soils of eastern South Dakota. Living and gardening in various places, he came to learn that such soils are not everywhere, and has thus long had an interest in how to improve and maintain soil. Professionally, he has worked as a civil engineer and a math/computer/robotics teacher. Currently, he is a stay-at-home parent. Ethan?
All right, thank you, Abby. And I'll share the screen here. Okay. So gardening for the future, the importance of cover crops, and my name, Ethan Swanson again, and I'm a Master Gardener volunteer here in Olmsted County. So just to start off, what is a cover crop? And it's any crop designed to provide a benefit other than harvesting. So most of the time, you think of crops as something you harvest like corn or beans, but a cover crop is something you're not going to harvest. Often grown before or after the main crop, and it's something to take advantage of the growing season, the excess sunlight, heat, water. If you plant some tomato plants, you don't need to plant them until, no chance of frost, and as soon as the frost hits, they're done. Well, there's still things you can grow on either side of that season. And so a cover crop is just, let's take advantage of this growing season and try and do something with it that will help our garden out. So for example, you could grow clover so you can fix nitrogen for future crops. This used to be more common on farms as a way to get nitrogen into the soil before it became pull nitrogen from the air, but it's still a good method. You might try and grow some forage for livestock or game. Here you got some cows eating sorghum Sudan and millet, but you could also just as easily grow some canola seed or some turnips or sunflowers, anything that would benefit whatever animal you are trying to. Cover crops are a great way to prevent soil erosion, so you don't get gullies ripping through your soil. If you got roots in your soil, it's a lot harder for it to wash away. Cover crops can also be really good at suppressing weeds and acting as a mulch. This picture here, the person had planted rye. That's what all the brown stuff is. And as it was getting close to maturity, I'm guessing they sprayed it with Roundup, and then they came in and put in their soybeans. And so now their soybeans pop through and everything else, you just got this nice mulch there. You have way less weed problems, won't need to do as much spraying for weeds with it, and it'll hold moisture better if it gets dry. Cover crops are sometimes planted to attract beneficial insects. You might get some wasps or ladybugs or parasitic flies, and those are all predators towards insects that can harm crops. So if you grow the right cover crops, you might help out and have lower insecticide. Cover crops have been used to reduce disease instances. Mustard and radish crops have helped in potatoes. Cover crops, by having them, you host microorganisms that discourage disease. They make the soil environment less hospitable to disease. If you think about having a bunch of green stuff growing close to the ground, it's a humid environment. There's lots of little organisms alive. It's tough for a disease that's living on a dead leaf to survive, because something's probably going to come along and eat it. And having biodiversity decreases incidence of soil disease. So instead of just growing a monocrop, one crop, you get something else growing there that year with the cover crop. You can have less likelihood of soil disease. But the big one I want to talk about with this presentation is using cover crops to improve the soil. As stated in the introduction, that's something I'm really interested in and passionate about. And I think having good soil is the most important thing you can do to have a good garden.
Ethan, your mic was cutting out for that last part.
Okay, should I try talking louder?
Yeah, louder and a little bit closer to your computer, I think. Like I can hear you great now.
Okay, I will do that. All right, so the reason cover crops help improve the soil is cover crops add organic matter to the soil. They increase the amount of organic matter in the soil. And organic matter includes living stuff like roots, little microorganisms like fungi, bacteria, protozoa, microarthropods, all sorts of little tiny creatures. It includes the dead, which would be dead roots, dead plant residue, dead microorganisms, the waste from microorganisms. And then there's the very dead, which would be a substance called humus. It occurs when organic matter is able to decay in the right fashion. And at that point, it's hard to even tell what originally was. So it qualifies, I guess, as very dead. Okay, so why is organic matter helpful in your soil? To start off, more organic matter means less compaction. Organic matter is softer stuff. It holds the soil particles apart from one another, and it gives a place for roots to grow. So if you can see here, you can see all the little different ways the roots can go on this plant. And the more root growth you got, the more access to water and nutrients your plants have, the happier they're going to be. And so that's the first big thing organic matter does for you. Organic matter helps a ton with water infiltration and storage. So here we have this soil, the little visual I have calls it chemical soil, but you can just think of it soil that doesn't have a lot of organic matter. And even if you just tilled it, if you get a hard rain, it's really easy for a crust to form on that soil. And so when the rain comes down, it's gonna tend to wash off as much as it infiltrates. And so you're not getting water down into the soil very easily, unless you have a really slow, gentle rain. And maybe you haven't noticed, we don't always get slow, gentle rains. So having the ability to infiltrate into the soil is really important. And organic matter helps with that. Again, it pushes those soil particles apart. It helps create channels. It acts as having all the little particles on the surface stops it from forming a crust that's so impermeable, and so the water can get in there better. And then once the water is in there, having organic matter increases how much that soil can hold. So this stat here, if you can raise your organic matter 1%, you'll retain an extra 20,000 gallons of water per acre. was like, well, that's kind of neat, but that's just a big number to me. What's it mean, realistically? And it means, that extra 1% is going to give you an extra 0.88 inches of precipitation storage. So, that might give you almost an extra week that you don't have to irrigate your garden if you've raised your organic matter 1%. So, more organic matter, more water gets in, and you hold it longer and better. So it's very good for your plants. All right, having organic matter can help with your nutrient availability. So a lot of plants depend on kind of a symbiotic relationship with microorganisms in the soil to give them nutrients. And you got the plant roots, and they're collecting sunlight and carbon dioxide, and they produce sugars. And one of the things they do with those sugars is they will put them out of their roots in the soil, and they'll feed the microorganisms in the soil. And those microorganisms in turn free up nutrients from the soil, or maybe from other dead organic matter that they're decomposing, and feed it to the plants. So by having these living roots in the soil, for more of the gardening season, that cover crops are going to have those, you'll have roots growing live instead of just having a dead garden. You're keeping this process going of keeping nutrients free and cultivating microorganisms that make nutrients available. And so that's a big reason to have cover crops. You're helping the soil all year long instead of just when you have. Does Roundup constitute a chemical soil? If you're trying to be truly organic, Roundup could constitute a chemical soil. It's just a slide I grabbed. I guess I'm more on a spectrum type person. As far as chemical, I'm not black or white. I would say using it in certain places offers a lot of benefits, and we can get into that a little bit more later. Okay, back to here. Storing nutrients. Organic matter acts as a food. We mentioned how it can be a food for microorganisms to feed plants. So if you got dead vegetative matter in the soil, the microorganisms will eat it, and their waste products can be available for plants. But if you get into that humus that we mentioned earlier, the living, the dead, and the very dead, that humus, it's a very specific form of degraded organic matter, and it is excellent at storing nutrients due to its incredible surface area. The way its structure is, it can just hold on to all sorts of different nutrients and minerals, even more so than clay, which is known as a very excellent nutrient holder. So if you get some of that in your soil, now you've got like an extra storehouse of nutrients for your plants. Again, that's a good thing to make your plants happy. Additionally, humus is really good at helping hold the structure. Because humus is slow to decay, it's going to hold that structure of the soil and hold those soil particles apart, so you have that better infiltration of water than just if you chopped up a bunch of leaves and buried it in the soil. Some of those would decay out within a year, and this humus is much more stable, lasts longer. It's what adds the darkness to the soil, and so it's pretty prevalent in plains states, northern Iowa, eastern South Dakota, southern Minnesota. Gives it a lot of that black color. So, resilience. We've looked at all these things that soil that's high in organic matter can help you do. It's going to take in water better, and it's going to hold on to more water. Your plants are going to have more root growth, so they're able to get at more water, more nutrients. There's going to be more nutrients available in the soil. You got this organic matter, it's just an excellent storehouse of nutrients. If you have anything that would cause pH changes, it's going to be a buffer for that. And your plants are going to be less susceptible to disease. I guess I would add that, I forgot to add this in. The more organic matter you have on the soil, the less of that splashing a raindrop off the soil will do. And so you're less likely to get disease. That's a big transfer of diseases, is when raindrops hit the soil and splash it onto the leaves. And organic matter, you get less splash. I wouldn't say no splash, but you certainly get less. All right, so anyway, if your plants are doing all this, they're going to handle droughts better, they're going to handle intense rains better, they're going to handle heat waves better. I don't know if you remember this last summer, but we saw a lot of all three of these. And so if you want to have gardens that can stand up better to that, find ways to increase the organic matter. And as cover crops, you got all those roots grown in the soil, they are a better way to do that. Okay, so big idea. I'm trying to get the biggest idea I can out of this presentation. It's use cover crops to increase organic matter, and you will see multiple benefits. Okay, so I've talked up cover crops here, but let's talk a little bit more specifics about how you can do cover crops. So one way you can do it is plant before warm season crops. So this spring, I garden at the History Center Community Gardens, and they got that tilled at the end of April. And I went in there in the first part of May in one of my plots, and I put in a bunch of oats, flax, clover, vetch, phacelia. And I let it grow for a month before I put in tomatoes and peppers and squash, cucumbers and stuff. And so that was something I could plant and let it grow and start getting roots into the ground and start getting the nutrient cycle going and start adding organic matter to the soil. Got to do all that before I put anything in the ground. You can plant after early season crops. So I had 2 plots at the History Center. The other one I planted right away. I planted beets, potatoes, cabbage, peas, kohlrabi, all things that went in the ground pretty early. And I was able to pull out, end of July, early August. And so now I got a lot of growing season left. I got half of August, and this year I've gotten all of September and a good chunk of October too. And so into that soil, I put some rye, winter peas, clover, vetch, rapeseed. That's like canola seed, another word for that. You could also just leave an area of your garden fallow for the year. And then you're going to use the whole growing season to try and improve that. Well, they had a plot next to mine that nobody claimed. And I talked with Kurt Shellum, the garden manager, and he said, well, yeah, go ahead and do a cover crop experiment on it. And so rather than just let it get filled up with weeds that maybe at best you mow down with your lawnmower, I put in some sorghum, Sudan, soybeans, millet, African cabbage, and those all grew a lot. We'll see some pictures of this later so you can kind of get an idea of what all this stuff looked like for me. I know of people who have done planting in walking paths, maybe do clover or winter wheat or something that's not going to grow very much. If you got a wide enough walking path between your rows for a lawnmower, you could kind of do whatever you wanted. And if you got an edger, so it doesn't creep into your plant area, you could certainly grow whatever. I don't have a lot of experience with this, but it's something I want to consider in the future. You can plant cover crops amongst your main crop. Maybe let the main crop get started and then put some stuff in. I know Master Gardener Kelly Kirkpatrick, she likes to put down oat straw around her plants and then let the oats take off, and the plants are way ahead of it, but then you got an oats cover crop kind of coming up behind it. And then she'll actually pull it during the year and use it as a mulch. But you could also, if you got some plants that are getting close to maturity, you could try and work in some cover crops around them, just so you're getting that next thing going before the main crop is done. That one takes a lot more, I'll just say it's a lot more prone to problems, but it's still pretty good. What is African cabbage? It's a very deep-rooted brassica. That's about all I can tell you about it. I'll find out more in coming years as I use it.
As a follow-up question, what is a brassica?
So brassica is a family that would include like cabbage, broccoli, mustard, turnips, those types of plants.
Okay.
Thank you for asking. That's a good question here. Does kind of get into this next slide. So, I kind of showed you a few examples of what I used for cover crops, but just in general, mixes, they provide that more variety, so you're going to have just better disease suppression. And depending on conditions, one crop might not grow as well as the other. Mixes are also designed to complement one another. So you might have like something that provides nitrogen growing with something that's going to pick up, and together it creates more growth than either would alone. So there's a lot of benefits to mixes, though, you know, all you can find is a single oats to work with. You can start with that. Okay, so then I kind of broke them down into categories here. So there's grasses, I call them grasses, I guess agronomically speaking, they are grasses like oats, rye, barley, wheat. They're really good at scavenging nutrients, and they put out so many roots. They're good at improving soil structure. And by that, I mean, they're creating those pathways for water to flow down. Your soil crumbles really nice after you've had some of these grasses in it. Maybe you've dug up lawn before, you know, in that first shallow area where the roots are, the soil is always so nice and crumbly. Just imagine using it for garden soil. You know, that's improving the structure. That's what grasses are really good at. As far as scavenging nutrients, say if you do use fertilizer, this is really good at picking up loose nutrients. So they don't, nitrogen's really subject to getting washed away or getting into the air. And this will grab it and store it in vegetative matter that can later be decomposed. So grasses are really good for that. Brassicas, as we mentioned, mustards, turnips, rapeseed, canola. They have deep roots. There's some help with disease. They work well with others. Legumes, we're talking bees, beans, vetch, clover. There's more and more of them, but they're really good at fixing nitrogen. They have kind of a singular deep root usually, or just not a lot of root, so they can work well with grasses. You might have broadleaves. A lot of the beans are broadleaves too, but in particular buckwheat, it's very good at making phosphorus available. It can kind of pull away from the soil particles, and then the plant dies and it's more available for plants. It's also an incredible host for predator insects. I had some buckwheat growing this year, and just there were all sorts of wasps and ladybugs and parasitic flies. So buckwheat made a lot of that available. There's also these tougher crops like sorghum and sunflowers that are thought, keyword thought, to help establish more humus because of their slow breakdown. So that would be something else if you're trying to do really long-term soil improvement. I'm going to check the chat here. Okay, with cover crops suppressing plant disease. So the way I understand it is if you've got a mix of all these plants growing, you know, compare it to, say you just harvest your crop and you leave your soil bare. If you do that, you might have some dead plant matter there that already hosted some disease, and that whatever is growing on there, those leaves, is really good at just staying alive on those dead leaves over the winter. On the other hand, if you got those dead plant matter with disease on it, and you got this mix of cover crops growing, you know, that creates this very alive, very humid environment along the ground. You're going to have earthworms crawling up and grabbing stuff off the surface. You got all sorts of other little microorganisms munching on any kind of organic matter they can find. And so the disease is going to have less chance to just survive on that soil over the winter. That's part of the way I understood it. I also understood there's something about like mustard plants, some compound in there that particularly with potatoes, if they harvested the potatoes and then they grew a mustard cover crop and then tilled it into the soil, it did a good job of lowering the amount of disease in following seasons. And so in some cases, instead of having to have like a 3-year rotation with potatoes just to clean out disease, they were able to shorten it to a 2-year rotation to clean out disease. That's something of what I read. That would be the basics of what I know about it. I would say there's probably more to it, but that is above or beyond my current level of knowledge. All right, so let's see. I've been talking up cover crops, but they are not just some holy grail. There are issues with cover crops. It's fair to talk about those before you go out and start trying to buy some. Termination of cover crops. Some of these will survive over the winter. Rye is really good at surviving over the winter, and so you better have a plan to terminate it before you're going to put in your seeds. If you're doing some like oats or something before a warm season crop, you know, or you got a tiller where you can till it down. Do you want to tarp it with something and try and kill it? There's different ways, but definitely have a plan and realize it's not just going to suddenly, die for you. Unless it's frost, it'll get killed by, say, the winter. If you're planting oats and stuff in the fall, they grow up, they turn green, then the winter comes, they are dead and they do not come back. So, winter could terminate it for you, but be aware it won't, depending on when you're trying to use it or what the crop is, you might have to have a termination plan. Water usage. That cover crop I planted in first part of May, it did dry out the soil. So by the time the heat really struck in June, my soil did not have a lot of water reserve. I was still improving the soil. It didn't have as much organic matter as I wanted. And May had some rain, but these growing plants used it up, and then it just turned dry in June. And so my warm season garden, I had to just spend a ton of time watering. So water usage can be an issue if you don't have irrigation, especially. At the History Center Gardens, they do provide water, so I was very thankful. But if you don't, if water is going to be tough, you definitely have to think about that. I did read just a little about disease host, and this is probably more of an issue if you just plant a single crop, cover crop. It might end up hosting a disease. Again, it's something I read. I think if you have mixes, you're probably good, but just I wanted to mention it. Excess vegetative matter can interfere with planting. Beth could probably tell you something about this. If you grow a bunch of sorghum, you're going to have a lot of vegetative matter. You might have to have a plan for chopping it down and getting it out of the way. Even if you let the frost and winter kill it, there's still going to be a lot of stuff there in the spring if it's something that's not as quick to break down. Alternatively, if you have some oats or rye that take off, in the spring, you might have to chop those down and figure out what you're going to do with all the roots so you can, and all the surface vegetation so you can get your seeds planted. Allelopathic effects, I might have pronounced that wrong. Rye is known to have that effect. And so it's very good at suppressing weeds. Weeds have a tough time growing amongst rye. Rye roots put out, I don't know if it's chemicals or hormones or exactly what it is, but it suppresses weed growth. Well, even after you kill your rye, whether it's tilled or chopped or whatever, that effect can last for a couple of weeks, and it's more pronounced on small seeds, is my understanding. And so, if you till in your rye and the next day you want to plant some carrot seeds, you might have some germination issues with that. If you're planting bean seeds, you're not going to have any worries, but the smaller seeds, you can run into that. Cover cropping with plants. So if you're trying to grow plants, cover crop kind of next to something, you might have some competition issues, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a video I got coming up. Okay. So I don't know if I can make this bigger. So this kind of gives you an idea of the cover crop. You can see oats and flax and some brassicas. How is the sound quality on that? Abby?
I can hear it. It's a little quiet. If you want to turn the volume up a little bit more. So down at the bottom of your screen, right by the play button.
Right there, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, so this is the cover crop I put in early May in my warm season garden, and you'll probably be able to see some issues with it as I go through it, and I'll explain it after we watch the video. This is a mustard of some sort. Anyway, that's what I planted in the whole bed, and then I've kind of ripped it up and planted in other stuff as I went along. So like here's some peppers, and I ripped it out so I could mulch them. Similar with the tomatoes, the beans, right along here. The stuff hoed out really nice, just ran a hole through it and it worked pretty good. And I had to make a couple beds here because I wanted to plant some carrots, and that required some soil work. Got some summer squash, some winter squash. Again, I'm just going to rip out stuff as I need to rip it out, and it comes out pretty easily. And in the meantime, it's doing work on the soil, and it is providing habitat for beneficial insects. Okay, so I'm just going to skip. So this, mute, and I had to make As I said, this stuff did pull out really easily. I didn't even need to do a lot of pulling. If you get small enough, just hitting it with a hoe, really, it knocked it down, it killed it. It was great stuff to plant into. The problem I ran into, besides the fact that it did lower the soil moisture, the other problem I ran into was I left a lot of it standing because I wanted all these flowers to try and host some beneficial insects, and they did show up. But it got a lot harder. I think it had a detrimental effect on some of the plants, especially the squash, just seemed really slow to get going. So I think these roots were in competition with it, and it did not like it. And then, at this point, it was still really easy for me to pull out, but it got harder. And, when I started pulling it out, I started pulling out big clumps of soil as I went along. So if I was doing it over again, I would probably just leave a small area for beneficial insects and work to pull out or chop down the rest of it a lot more. But as far as what it did for the soil, it was really nice because when I planted it, there had been a hard rain and the soil was already crusted and it was tough to work the seed in. But then a month later with this stuff, just sending all sorts of roots through the soil, it was really easy to chop up and plant all my other stuff. So it immediately improved the soil. I was very impressed. Okay. Go to the next slide. So this is just a cover crop of lentils and clover, and they should die. They're designed to be, or it's a seed mix that should die with our winter, though we'll find out, I guess. And this is at the Heirloom Garden in the History Center. There they have a really high organic matter in the soil. Things grow really well, but they're nitrogen deficient. And so these were just planted because they are legumes. They put nitrogen back into the soil. And also they're, really neat and tidy. They grow really nice in the bed there. They don't just kind of form, my last garden, if you look, or the previous video, that looked a little messy. This does not. This is really neat and aesthetically pleasing. So, there are cover crops you can do if you just want something that looks a little more English garden-like. This is a quick video. It just kind of pans back and forth at the Heirloom Garden History Center. Again, you can just see, very neat as far as the way it stays in the rows. It's not getting too big. It's sending roots down. It's helping the process happen underground in the soil. And so just something to think about visually, what a cover crop can look like for you if you want it to. It doesn't have to be big and giant. Go to the next slide. We did a little digging in there. This is one of the clover roots. You can see it next to my hand here. Just give you some reference of what those clover roots look like underground. If you grow cover crops, it's fun just to dig them up every now and then and look at the roots and see what's going on underground, because that's where you're trying to make the improvement. And if you don't dig up and see what's happening, you're not going to know. If you zoom in, this is right here, zoomed in and circled. That's one of those little nitrogen fixing nodules. I should have cut it open to see if it's red. I guess if it's red on the inside, it's fixing nitrogen, but I did not do that. This is some of the other short stuff there at the Heirloom Garden. It's a mix of, you got these brassicas. I don't know if they're turnips or radishes. And it looks like you got some ryegrass growing here. So you got some plants that play nice together. Looks like you got some peas there too. So just a nice little pretty mix, very aesthetic, and it's still doing a good job helping the soil. There was a little bit of this pink buckwheat, rose red Soba buckwheat. And we kind of came to the conclusion we should have just done a whole row of this because that would have looked just absolutely stunning, along with providing some beneficial services. So hopefully we can find some more of that next year, maybe a bigger package than this. Okay, moving on. This plot here that you see, this is the one that was just, it was full of weeds that were going to go to seed. And so the manager let me do a cover crop experiment. So I put in this mix of seeds I talked about earlier. You got some sorghum and millet, buckwheat there. There's some soybeans there, and there's probably 10 or 12 species in there. Very thick, very green. It's not going to be able to get mature enough to go to seed, so you're getting a better option than weeds. You got a wider variety of roots. Seems like some of these gardens it's just a monocrop of weeds in some places, you know, so you're not even getting as good a services there that way either. This is a good mix, good thick, a lot of stuff going on. It did dry out a little later in the summer, but it did stay green up until the point where I chopped it down. Why did I chop it down? Well, start looking like kind of a cornfield. That's the sorghum Sudan. It kind of took over. I probably planted it a little thick. And so I wanted it to start rotting before the growing season was over, because I did not want to have to deal with all those stalks and material in the spring. I wanted to be able to get planting in the spring when I had to. And so I chopped that down. I wanted to see what would happen on the undergrowth, if some more beans would come up, but none did. So I ended up just chopping it even more. You know, so chop it down like this. As I said, you got to have a plan for what you're going to do with terminating the crop, what you're going to do with the vegetative matter. And so the bigger the crop, the more work it is. This one was a lot of work chopping it all down. I then ran my lawnmower over it back and forth several times. It dulled up the blade a little, but it certainly did a good job chopping it down. And then I I mixed in some compost and tilled it up and put on another cover crop that will survive the winter. So let's take a little bit of a tour here. This is a rye field pea mixture, which was planted September 20th. For reference, today is October 12th. So you can see when the weather cooperates, you can get a very good stand of cover crop in not a lot of time. So basically, I was a little nuts just wanting to try another cover crop. You know, I had the one that grew there most of the growing season, and then I thought, well, that's going to be a pain. Got to chop it down. Okay, well, let's just go ahead and do a winter one. And so the rye is going to survive the winter, and I'll have to have a plan to terminate it in the spring. But I'm getting more soil improvement, especially with all these fine grasses. And next video. So give a little bit of a tour here. This is, okay, so here I dug into the rye. So I popped a fork in and popped some out of the ground. And like I said, it's just kind of fun to see what's happening below the ground. That's where you're really trying to make the improvement. So you kind of see some of the roots going on down there. This is less than 3 weeks after planting, and it's already got some pretty good root action going on down there. And that soil structure looks pretty good. You definitely nice and crumbly. You can get a lot of water infiltration into that. This is some other cover crop. It got planted in late August, and as you can see, it probably had more than enough time. These cover crops were planted in mid to late August. You can see they've fully matured. They got the sunflowers blooming, the oats putting out little seed heads along with the barley and wheat. Got some brassicas here that are quite tall, and even more mature sunflowers and oats here. These oats are over 3 feet tall. So, and over on the edge here, you can see a little bit of flax flowers that made it all the way. And so that was just what happens when you get, it just grows faster than you think it's going to. And so I'll probably have to go in and chop this down so it rots well over the winter. If I wanted to make some straw for something, I could certainly get it here if I want to make a scarecrow. Check the chat. So voles, yeah, there's a lot of voles and stuff in the garden. I guess it didn't seem to affect how well my cover crops grew, I'll say, even though there were a lot of them. Raking it into the soil, if it's just a little bit buried and you water those seeds, they're going to germinate really fast. And so the ability of scavengers to eat the seeds that you've spread is going to be pretty low. And if you seed it even a little too thick, there's no way they're going to show up and eat enough of them, unless you have a whole flock of birds or something show up and really go to town on it. That's interesting though, because last year I did try and plant a little bit of rye at home in a little flower bed, and the chipmunks did dig it up and eat it. But that was a very small area and I have a lot of chipmunks at home, and squirrels. And so that, yeah, I guess if you got big enough plot, it's probably not going to happen, but I guess in a small plot, it definitely could. Thanks, Beth. Yeah, this is, and the important thing to remember with all this stuff above ground is there's a lot of stuff going on below ground again. I did not take a video of me digging this up, but there's a lot of root action going on down there. It did dry up the soil a little, but this is end of the growing season, so I'm not too worried about it drying up the soil because it's going to die over the winter. And assuming we get some snow and some rain in the spring, it shouldn't make any difference at all as far as the soil moisture come spring, except the soil will be better at infiltrating it. So I'll take that. These cover crops were planted in mid. There we go. Next slide. And so I did plant some rye in August, and this is just me kind of digging it up and showing some of the root action going on. This is some late August rye, and I mixed in some mustard greens, so you can see you can get a crop along with your cover crop. So if I wanted to harvest some greens, I could do that, and I'd still have some really healthy root action going on underground. If I dig into here and pull this up, you can see again that extensive root development that's going on there, and so that's all these little root hairs putting all that carbon into the soil and help building up your organic matter. Again, I just find it a joy to dig into the soil. So this is some late August rye. Okay. Here, this is that warm season garden. Now it's late in the year, and there was kind of some stuff where the plants were dying, so I pulled it out and I raked it up. And I started putting in some more cover crops just around my plants, because I'm going to let them keep growing until frost. And so it's just an experiment to see how well I can establish a cover crop while still trying to grow other things. So I'll let you see that. And this is some rye mix that was planted in early September. It's got some peas poking through and some lentils in it. Kind of growing right in amongst the crops that were planted much earlier. Slide around here, and you can see it taking over the pathways. This was something I did besides an experiment. Towards the end of the growing season, it's nice if your cover crop can have a little more time to mature. It just gives your soil more benefits. Especially if you have some legumes in there like peas or lentils, they're going to get more time to fix nitrogen. The rye is probably pretty good, even if you plant it. You could plant some rye probably tomorrow and still get some stuff going up that will survive the winter, but the lentils and peas will do better if they get a little more time. So just trying to plant while I still had other plants growing. That's all I was trying to do here, and something you can experiment with. And this is some rye mix that was planted in early September. It's got some peas. Okay. Here I dug up some of that soil, and it's interesting to note because this soil, the top part, I put a lot of compost on. The bottom part, I had not. And you'll kind of see a difference between the upper soil and the lower soil, just in color and root growth. So just watch this. I think it's interesting. This is a good example to show the difference with certain types of roots in soil.
So here towards the top of the soil, you can see the cover crop, just extremely thick growth of roots everywhere you look. And then as we get down in the soil profile, it kind of falls away. See if we can get a better view here. You know, there's less roots going on, and you can see the color's not as dark, and the soil's a little more compacted. And that's because this is some soil I never really properly dug up, and it got walked on a lot, and I didn't mix any organic matter in deep. And so you can see there's definitely, it's harder for the roots to grow in this stuff right there.
And that's just an example, going back to that earlier point about having organic matter, you get better root growth.
This is a good example.
You know, here's a picture of it with, again, with my hand just for reference. And I zoom in on it, you kind of see all the roots there, less roots there. A little more demonstration slide here. So if you got more organic matter, you're going to get more root growth. If you got more root growth, now you have even more organic matter. So that would be an example of a positive feedback loop. You know, so growing cover crops improves the soil, and it just sets off positive cycles for you. You know, and then just pointing out that down here where the soil is a little more compacted, there's less root growth going on. These cover crops do a good job though of starting to make inroads into the packed soil. You know, so if you're thinking about just, you know, dumping compost on top of your soil for organic matter, that can help, but cover crops are able to start sending roots and less organic matter deeper into your soil than the compost alone can do. And just kind of a note here, you know, if you don't have organic matter, soil particles, especially around here, we have mostly loam soils, you know, and they have just enough clay in them where they can get pressed together pretty easily and not be nearly as, not have near as high an infiltration. It won't let as much water in. So. Another thing to think about, almost done here, is a lot of times the garden, you know, you get done in July, August, and then you forget about it and suddenly it's full of weeds like this. And they're all going to go to seed. They hardly need any time at all, it seems like, to go to seed. And so if you plant some cover crops there, it's going to look better. It's not going to produce a bunch of weed seeds. And it's just something, it kind of gives you something to do later in the garden year when a lot of the stuff is winding down. And then kind of finally, just thinking about your soil, you know, what's going on with your soil based on what you're planting above it. You know, are you creating good soil structure with lots of roots that you just can see vegetable seeds taking off in? You know, can you just imagine putting something in here and the way the roots are going to shoot out and the plant up above is going to be healthy? You know, are you creating a system that does that? You know, cover crops definitely. Okay. So, Abby, I have a couple slides on the history of cover crops. I wasn't sure if we should do those or if we wanted to start taking questions about cover crops.
I think we can start doing the history of cover crops because you have a couple more minutes because you've been answering questions as we go. So I don't see any in the chat at the moment.
Okay. So this is just more recent research I've done, and it's not something I'm as passionate about, but I did think, well, let's look into this a little. We are presenting for the History Center, and let's try and find some information. So if you go back to the beginnings of agriculture, you know, 10,000 or whatever years ago, it was kind of a system that developed over time. There's some great podcasts on that, but very early on, the idea of having fields be fallow was something that was used. It was found that the soil, by having a break, would become more productive. And maybe you would grow something there and just kind of plow it back into the soil. And that was found to help. You know, it's called a green manure. You know, and reading back, a common early system was to grow a grain like wheat or barley, followed by some sort of, you know, legume, probably a lentil, and then let it be fallow for a year. Green manure, that's where you grow a cover crop and then you plow it in to try and get a lot of organic matter into the soil and also kill the cover crop so you're preparing the seed bed for the next year. That was known by the ancient Chinese, Romans, Greeks. So that's a system that goes back at least 2,000 years, but probably a lot further. Just we start running out of written records going that far back, and the archaeology probably isn't always looking for if they're doing green manure, or if it isn't reported. But reverting to pasture, that's another system that was used. You could take a field and plant some grass or clover into it and let it grow for 10 years. And then you could get, that's those grasses. They would give that soil great structure. And then you could get 3 good years of crops out of it, it was found. Some great results, but you need a lot of pasture system to make that work. And it takes a lot of work to start a pasture. Sometimes if, you were trying to start a pasture this June, good luck. It would have fried before the grass even got mature. And breaking up sod is not easy work, especially not when you were using animals to pull the plows. Go forward in time a little bit. The British Agricultural Revolution, as it's called, 1750-ish as a starting date or so. It's the date historians look back and throw on it, But there was a crop rotation systems that were being developed, and they would include years where you would grow, one year you might grow turnips, and another year you might grow clover, and then the other 2 years you're growing your grain crops or your lentil crops or something for your animal, for creating a crop. But these two, they were found they could feed the livestock, and so you got more food options, and it broke up that just kind of, it's a little more, it was found to have more benefits to the soil and the yield effect on the other crops than just kind of the 3 system. This 4-year system seemed to do better. Then as you get later into the 19th century, shipping allowed the importation of guano, really concentrated bird and bat manure from, thousands of miles away. The shipping costs were becoming so cheap. And this stuff was so potent, you could start just putting that on crops to get a lot of nutrients, so you didn't have to do as much cover cropping. You move forward in time, you get the manufactured nitrogen, right around World War I. So again, you're finding other ways to get to the nutrients. You don't need to think as much about what you're planting. Specialization of crops, where you kind of do the corn bean rotation, and you get bigger farms to do it because they can do it more profitably, or on thinner margins, maybe is a better way of saying it. And so there was a push away from the use of cover crops just because of how farming was, and as far as size, and also the availability of fertilizers. But in recent years, if you're a smaller farmer and you can't expand because you don't have the money or you just don't have the options where you live, you need to come up with some other competitive advantages. And cover crops did present that opportunity. If you can grow something that helps improve your nutrients or suppresses weeds, well, then you don't have as many inputs. And at the same time, you're protecting and improving your soil, which just gives you better year-to-year crops. You can withstand that drought better. And so, it was kind of a competitive advantage for small farms. And this is why my brother farms, and that's kind of why he got into it. He was just looking for ways to, he didn't have the situation where he could expand, so he was just looking for ways to do better with what he had. And that's what cover crops were. Also, the government sees cover crops, they protect water quality. If you're growing something after the bean crop that's holding the soil in place, it's going to soak up, it's going to grab excess nutrients, so you don't have as many of those washing into the water. By holding the soil in place, you don't get as much phosphorus running into the water. If you can boost beneficial insect population, that's also good. And so there has been funding over time for farmers to do trials with cover crops. In some cases, there's a lot of programs for that. So that's kind of been the reemergence of cover crops. And then just given the gardening community's preference probably for trying to be organic and trying to find natural ways of doing things, cover crops fit in quite well with that. And so they've shown up a lot in the gardening community in the last several years too. Okay, questions. Hang on, I'm going to answer the chat first and then we'll go with audio questions. Didn't the Dust Bowl have a big impact on farming and cover crops? It could have. I know that led to no-till. I'm not sure if it led to cover crops. Instead of just like plowing the soil after you harvested that wheat, you might let just the wheat sit there and then try and plant something else into it in the spring without disturbing the soil. I don't know on cover crops. I didn't read that, but that certainly doesn't mean anything. So. Okay, does anybody have any other questions or things they just want to clarify or anything? We can do chat or we can do audio. What is the latest in the season? One can plant cover crops, i.e. what month? Well, rye is probably about the latest cover crop you can plant, and it will germinate in pretty cold weather. So if you got some of that, I would feel comfortable planting that, towards late October, I would say. If you got something that's gonna, like oats that are gonna die once they get a hard frost, that backs up then probably more into mid-September. Can cover crops completely repair soil? Yeah, if you give them long enough, they certainly can. If you give them thousands of years, that's kind of how soil was formed. On a shorter time span, though, as far as using cover crops to repair the soil, I'll just take the example of what I've seen in the community garden that I'm using this year. That soil has been, I'll just say, not treated kindly. It's still got a lot of potential. It's a good silt, or not a good silt, a good loam, silty loam, clay loam. It's a decent soil, but it's lacking in organic matter. It compacts easily when it rains. I just put that cover crop down on top of it in May, and a month later, it was a lot more workable. It still had problems, but it was a lot more workable. I sped up the process in my other plot by mixing in compost too. And so that just kind of speeds the whole process along. If you're trying to really do things fast, which I was trying to do, I mixed compost in deep and then I planted cover crops too. If you're just using cover crops, it'd probably take a few years before you notice that it was really improved, I would say. I don't know if that answers the question or you'd like me to explain further.
I had a question because I think that answered the last one. Some of the cover crops you've been mentioning are foods that I recognize. I mentioned at the beginning, I am by no means a farmer or gardener. Do you harvest and save those edible cover crops, or do you just kind of leave them out to decay?
The best option is to leave them to decay. Then you got that organic matter in the soil. But if you want to pull some of them to eat them, my earliest experience with cover crops, my brother, he got a farm grant program to try it out, and he planted some turnips. And he planted them after some wheat. So they were planted about early August. And they grew up. They were a lot of vegetative matter. Acres and acres of them. And they growing up in that cool weather, they were extremely sweet. And so we'd just be out there walking and eat some. And so, especially if you got them mixed in with other stuff, well, you could like rip the greens off and leave them there to rot and eat the turnip, or maybe you just eat the greens and leave the root to rot. If you're trying to maximize advantage, you don't, but you certainly can. I would harvest them if I was hungry. And they're going to be better than anything you can buy at the store. A lot of crops in this cool weather that, they mature really nice and they taste good. So I'd say harvest them if you want to.
And Ethan, if you want to stop sharing your screen,
Yeah.
we can also have people raise their hands if they want to ask questions audibly.
Okay.
And so you're welcome to turn on your camera and raise your hand, or there's also a little reactions button at the bottom of your screen and you can raise your hand there and I'll see that too.
And if you just want to share any experiences with the, the Heirloom Garden, feel free.
I did notice in some of your pictures that it looked like there was straw or hay lining some of the beds. Is that to prevent weeds from growing?
That was, some of the straw was just stuff I had picked and laid down, but the big bed of straw, I was trying to germinate carrots in that June heat. And if I didn't want to leave the soil bare, I was just afraid it would cook them. And so I put straw over it and just to keep the soil cool and hold in more moisture. And they did great, so it worked.
Okay. Is that something that a cover crop could have done as well?
The way I terminated it, no, because I hoed it in and so the soil was exposed. But if you if you solarized it, if you laid down a black sheet of plastic or even a clear sheet of plastic and let it kill the cover crop, yeah, then it could have done that.
Okay.
That's a good question.
We had another question coming from the chat. Are there any cover crops that deter pests? You talk about attracting things that will eat pests, but is there anything that will deter them?
Guess I don't know enough to say. I know like a mint plant has been known to deter certain types of cabbage moss, but they spread so bad, you're better off just having them in pots and putting them around your plants.
Peggy's suggesting onions.
Oh, I might. I haven't used onions as a cover crop, but it's certainly, you could certainly try something like that. I want to try working next year more with trying to have some, like I've been reading about how buckwheat and clover host a lot of beneficial insects. So I'm trying to figure out if I can have some of that growing while my plants are kind of in their growing stage. If I can set aside a little area, do enough. Peggy, did you have any experience using onions? Like, have you noticed anything?
Unmute myself there.
Okay.
No, but if you plant alliums, and then you don't get as much bulk and moisture from the root mass. If you plant alliums, they tend to keep deer and critters away from your ornamentals.
Okay.
So people who garden with ornamentals, know sometimes, you can surround something with alliums, and the deer are much less likely to come in and want to nibble on it because they don't like the smell of the alliums.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if that would help with insects, but definitely, yeah, deer. And does it help with rabbits?
Yep, it does.
Okay.
Rabbits are not nuts about onions.
Yeah, okay. Let's see, we got another question here. Make sure that's the most recent one. Okay, we're going to start here with this one from Alan. Do you want to say anything about farms that use chemical fertilizers and how their soil deteriorates over time? This seems to be a problem in a lot of places. Sure. Nitrogen, especially that chemical nitrogen. It's really strong stuff, and it helps speed the breakdown of organic matter. And so, if you're using nitrogen that's in that, high potency form, you are going to hurt your organic matter, which, we've seen all the benefits for organic matter. So using too much of it can harm your crop. On the other hand, trying to generate your own nitrogen sufficiently, using legumes and just the right forms of organic matter and organic content, it's not as easy. It's way easier to just go buy some strong nitrogen, spread it, and get the results. And so, I tend to use right now, just with my time availability, I will use the Miracle-Gro nitrogen stuff, just their balanced formula that is very strong. And I try to put it on sparingly, but I also know that if I have some excess compost, then I got a little bit higher organic matter. I'm kind of buffering my losses by using that. But it's, if you're trying to do the best you can, yeah, I would get away from the chemicals, but just, you got to do what works best for you. If you're a farmer trying to do this, just watching my brother use cover crops and stuff, sometimes when you really feel like you got to go out on a limb to throw out one of your best tools that helps your yields. And so he's just tried to go more the route of decreasing the amount he has to use by using cover crops. Also, if you're a farmer trying to get, an organic source like chicken manure, that's got enough potency. Trying to get enough of that to cover a field isn't always easy, depending on where you live and what your equipment is or what your connections are. And so I guess I see a lot of use still for the chemical fertilizer. Whether you want to go the route of getting rid of it or just trying to use less of it, I think either way cover crops offer that potential. Okay. One more thing about that chemical fertilizer. When you are destroying all that organic matter, you are hurting the microbial life that's feeding that food chain too. So again, that's a reason to try and use less of it. Use it more sparingly. Okay, so Beth, do you think mustard crop hold potential to deal with rotation issues with nightshade crops. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, ground cherries, not much rotation possibility in a small garden.
Before you start, can you explain the difference between mustard crops and rotation crops, or sorry, nightshade crops?
Okay, so nightshade crops, it's a family, I believe is the correct term, but that's like a tomato, a pepper, an eggplant. I believe potatoes are also a nightshade plant. They all got these certain, their leaves tend to kind of look similar. They can carry disease from one plant to another, especially year over year. So if you don't have enough space to rotate, especially if you got a variety of nightshade crops, it's tough to make a rotation work, and you kind of leave the potential for disease always open. I do not know if mustard would be the best. They did use it with potatoes, which is a nightshade crop, so it might be worth investigating. I think, again, just having a variety of crops that are going to have more life going on after, if you can have stuff that's growing there and helping everything decay after frost and speeding up that decay.
I think I'm going to skip going down there.
After this stuff
I'm
here.
going to skip going down there.
Okay. So, if you got a lot of crops growing, if you got some rye and oats and peas and you got that live environment after your tomatoes are already dead or pulled out of the ground, I think that's going to help with disease. What else was I going to say? Oh, yeah. A lot of those diseases I know with tomatoes especially come from that rain splashing and going up. And so, again, if you got more organic matter in the soil because you've had some cover crops, or if you kind of save some of your cover crop above ground stuff as a mulch, that will also help then with disease being splashed that way. I don't know, Beth, I think we got an experiment to try with the mustard crops though.
Can you explain a little bit more about soil disease? And so is this just like a bacteria that lives in the soil? What is that?
I wish I knew more. I'm still in the learning process on that. My understanding, or at least what I've seen, is there's a lot of leaf diseases that will take hold on a leaf, and then that leaf dies, falls to the ground, and it just seems to be very stable until the next year when it gets another opportunity to get back onto the plant.
So it's not really something that's like living in the soil, it's on top of the soil. And that's the problem.
Probably cases where it's living in the soil. I don't, this is kind of above my knowledge level. You need a more experienced person to answer that. Just kind of what I've understood is then if you have, so if it's even, even if it is living in the soil, if you've got more biodiversity, more bacteria, fungi variety going on, eating stuff in the soil, that's a harder environment for disease to survive in than if you just have a bare soil that's low in organic matter and not much happening. I would say that much I do understand.
Most of this presentation has been over my head, so that's been really great.
Okay. Well.
You've mentioned your brother's farm a couple times. I was wondering how practical cover crops are on like those larger scale farms. So I was wondering how big his farm is and can that be scaled up or scaled down?
He farms several hundred acres, and he has the most success where he grows like oats or wheat or something, and you get to harvest it with still a lot of growing season left. You'll harvest that late July, early August, and then that's a good opportunity to get the ground's available, put the seed in, and if you get a rain, stuff will grow really well. Trying to follow up something like corn is probably the hardest because they like to leave corn in the field to dry. Those hard frosts help dry out the corn and get it ready. He got some money to try one year doing some air seeding of rye, and that didn't work out very well. I did see somebody else down in Iowa who air seeded some rye, and they got an inch of rain right afterwards. And so all that rye that was on the ground just sprouted up, and that'll work pretty well. I don't know if there's any other ways to try and get a cover crop going within a large acreage like that. Beans, if you get them out early, you could have the opportunity to do that, get something going. I know if, it's something they're trying to encourage in farming fields, I believe. Like they've had this buffer strip along waterways, some of those rules. And I believe if you planted cover crops, they gave you credit towards doing that. You didn't have to have the buffer strip. And then there's other people who will try some relay cropping where they kind of mix wheat and beans together. There's a lot of other systems, but those are the ones I'm familiar with. It's not as easy on big acres as it is on the garden. I'll just say that it's a harder thing to do. What is the easiest cover crop for beginning gardeners to use? Probably oats. Oats and peas. They pull out of the ground easy, so if you plant them in the spring, it's easy to clear them. If you plant them late in the year, the winter will kill them and they'll rot really well, and so you don't have termination issues or cleanup issues in the spring. Oats and peas, I would say mix in some turnips and you got a pretty good mix. Oh, I should mention, I get a lot of my mixes. I'm not sharing my screen, am I? I'm gonna share my screen.
Ethan, you froze there briefly. I wasn't
Okay.
sure if you missed something.
No.
Okay.
So I just wanted to show people this. This is green cover seed. They have a lot of mixes. 20 some different mixes they can sell. This one is a great mix. It'll kill over the winter. It'll improve your soil. It promotes the growth of mycorrhizal fungi. And if you've got some people to share it with, it makes even the shipping cost worth it. Or if you got a really big plot. And they got some other stuff you can use there. And that's what I've been using for cover crops. There's a lot of garden catalogs that share it, but if you can find some place that does it in bulk, and you can find some people to share with, I'd say that's a much better option.
Great. Are there any other questions?
Thanks for the question, Gene. That's a really good one.
Great. I think we're going to start to wrap up then. So thank you so much to our audience tonight for asking so many great questions, and to our presenter for sharing his time and expertise with us. We hope that you enjoyed tonight's program and that you continue to join us in the future as we discuss everything from Rochester stories to Civil War battlefield photography and so much more. Check out our website, olmstedhistory.com, to keep up to date on all of our events and programs. If you enjoyed tonight's program, consider making a donation to help us continue to offer this and other great programs, or consider becoming a member. A History Center of Olmsted County membership offers a wide variety of benefits, including access to free and reduced cost events like this. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.